Hey everyone, thanks Cassie for that awesome intro. So I'm really excited to be here today, and this topic is pretty interesting, right? It's everyone works on open source, but what is the legal side of it, right? So let's see here. So thanks for the intro already. So a little bit more about myself is I've been working in open source, mainly the compliance side for a little over 10 years. And before that, I actually wrote code pretty badly, and I'm glad I'm out of that. So I worked at various tech startups writing Windows mobile code for radio frequency scanners, right? So that's what I did before, and stumbled onto open source compliance really by some random chance. There was this company that made a static analysis open source license detection tool that I just found on Craigslist and interviewed with them. And it was very interesting, and that was more than 10 years ago. And they hired me. So a lot of the
Indira, if you can hear me, I think you may be having some technical issues with the audio.
You can pause the recording.
Hi everyone, sorry. that was a Zoom mishap on my end. Apologies. I'm not sure where I dropped off, but I guess I was talking about all the bad code that I wrote many years ago. So these days I'm actually consulting, and I help clients with open source license compliance. I also do a lot of tech due diligence and M&As. And I'm also one of the contributors on one of the open source compliance tooling that we actually released as open source. So I can talk about that as well. So the agenda for today's, my talk today is a quiz, which is everyone's favorite, right? So we'll do that first. We'll do an introduction to open source licenses. What are the common issues that we see on the field? How do you use open source licenses to drive adoption? You might be working on an open source project. What kind of license, based on what you want to do with it, what kind of license should you be using? These are things that I help my clients with as well. A little bit of compliance in the real world. What does it look like when you join a company? Is it something that you need to care about? Do you what does it look like, right, in a real world scenario? We'll talk about some of those use cases and some information about the legal side. I'll even have some time for some Q&A if you want to ask me some questions about the work I do. That'd be awesome. Okay, so here's the quiz, right? And I'm not sure what the best way to do this is, but what do you think, Cassie?
I think we can just enter responses in the chat for
Yeah,
the first question.
Awesome. If you're sure, is free software the same as open source software, right? So what do you guys think? Is it really free? And should you care about open source licenses, right? So let's see here. We'll give you guys a few minutes. Awesome. So I think we can end the talk right here, right? Just kidding. Okay, cool. So not free, no, question mark, not sure, and no. Okay, so cool. Yes, we should care, of course. Yes. So the answer to that question is yes. So thanks, everyone. Yeah, so free software and open source software in the field, they're actually used interchangeably, right? So free software and open source software, they're philosophically, some people might say that they're the same thing. But the way I like to differentiate is free as in free speech and free as in free beer, right? Those are two different things. Open source software is usually associated with an open source license, right? And free software is stuff that you find online, right? For free for download, you can call it freeware. We don't know what the license is for those things. Sure, you can use it, but it's at your own risk. Is it really free? That's a very that's a loaded question, right? So based on the license of the software, it's not really free. You could have things like, you could use this code in your software, but if you incorporate it and you sell your software for money, then guess what? You have to pay the author of the software too, right? That's one of the things. Or you might have to release your code to the open source community for free as well. So that's another obligation, right? So it all depends on what the license is. So in the open source world and open source software world, you really do need to care about licensing. Whether you're a consumer of open source software or you're producing it yourself, right? So the intake is as important as the output as well, right? Trying to move to the next slide. Okay. So here are some of the popular open source um, products that you might have seen and used and heard of, and maybe you use it, you work on it, you're very well aware of it, but are you aware of the licensing of these products, right? So Linux, for example, is GPL. The license is the GPL 2.0. The Mozilla browser is an MPL licensed product, and we'll talk more about these licenses in detail. And Android OS is Apache 2.0. It does have some GPL kernel parts as well. React Native is MIT licensed, and Apache Struts is Apache 2.0. So these are, each of these licenses has a different meaning in how you use these products, right? So it becomes important when you're using these products to build your own products and distributing those products out there again, right? So if let's move to the next one here. Give me 1 second here. Okay. You guys can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay, maybe this is the best way. For some reason, I'm not able to move through the screens easily with Zoom. Okay, so licensing, open source licensing, there's two buckets into which licenses are usually cast. One is the copyleft license and one is the permissive license, right? So copyleft, as the name suggests, is you there is this notion of copyright, right? So when you have a, for example, a book, and you have an author, and the content of the book is copyright Cassie, for example, right? So that means that Cassie owns the IP, the intellectual property, and the contents of that book. The same kind of notion applies to software as well. So, for example, Cassie writes code and says copyright Cassie, right? And that means that Cassie is the owner of the code. She gets to decide how her work is going to be used by other people if she chooses to open source it, right? Now, if you open source your code, you have the option of using any of the open source licenses available to you, right? So you could go with a copyleft license or a permissive license. Let's see here. Okay, so to go further into types of licenses, there are strong copyleft licenses, weak copyleft licenses, permissive licenses, prohibitive licenses, and vanity and weird licenses. So an example of a strong copyleft license is an Affero GPL license or the AGPL license or the GPL family of licenses. A weak copyleft license is something like the Mozilla license, the Mozilla public license, or the lesser general public licenses are weak copyleft. The differentiator between strong and weak is how they are linked or how they are used. So there's this notion of dynamic and static linking, right? So if you're using LGPL license and you're dynamically linking, it means that the strong copyleft nature of the license will not apply, right? So we'll go over this in some more detail in the next slides. And the permissive license is you can do whatever you want with it, basically. So Cassie writes code, releases it open source, and says, here's my code. I want everyone to use it. I want everyone to benefit from this. I really would like credit for my work. So give me a attribution if you're using my code. And that's it, right? There's nothing else that's needed. So that family of licenses are permissive licenses. Then there's the prohibitive licenses. An example of that would be a Creative Commons non-commercial license. It's called CC by NC. So that license, what it states is that you can use the software that I wrote for whatever you want, but you can't use it in a commercial application. So for example, I'm company A, right? And I really like this code, which is open source. And I want to use it to build my own library to do some data processing or something, right? So I use it. And then what I do is I build my software and I release it. And now that software that I built is actually, I charge people money for it, right? So I say you can use it, but you have to pay me a licensing fee of whatever, like $1,000 a year or whatever it is, right? So now the creator of that prohibitive license can come and sue me and say, hey, my license doesn't allow you to do this because I said you could use it and do whatever you want with it. But you know what? You're not supposed to sell. My work shouldn't be in a commercial product, right? So that's an example of prohibitive license, and there's plenty of those floating around, right? Because people can choose to license their work however they want to choose to license their work. It's up to the consumer to figure out and make sure that you're using the work that complies with the license. So this whole field of open source compliance is what I do, right? So this is basically a lot of it is to try to figure out that people are complying with these licenses in the right way and make sure that the usage is respectful of what the author wants you to do, right? Okay, so with open source software, there can be while it's awesome, it's great, right? Open source is everywhere. Everyone's consuming it. It's awesome. I work on open source projects too. I love it, right? But what are the common issues that you see when you use open source software? There's vulnerabilities, right? So you might have heard of the struts vulnerability, the Equifax hack that happened recently, right? So a lot of data was compromised. There's the heartbleed issue with the OpenSSL. So that's another example. These are all brought in through open source, through the use of open source products, right? So Equifax was using struts, and struts had like a event stream vulnerability. So struts had a dependency on something else that had a hole. So hackers exploited that and then gained access to data, right? So this is one of the most common things companies are trying to prevent is not being vulnerable to hacks, right? And open source has vulnerabilities that need to be patched. Um, so that's one thing. The second thing is lawsuits. So when you don't use licenses correctly, that opens your company up to lawsuits. The most famous one is Google versus Oracle for Java, right? So that was happening. There's Cisco and Linksys. If you would look these up, these are big lawsuits in the open source world, right? So Cisco got sued, and there's a lot of there's a bunch of these lawsuits that keep happening, right? And these are mainly due to not complying with open source licenses, right? There's also the valuation and PR issue there, which usually happens when companies are looking to get bought or sold, right? So if you're using open source software and you don't understand licensing and you really don't know what went into building your product that now you want to sell to a Google or Apple or Facebook or whoever, right? Then they're going to want to know what you're using to build your product. And if you're using stuff, and having said that, most software written these days has, 95% open source in it. The things that people are trying to figure out is, are you using these licenses correctly, right? So are you putting stuff in there that's not a friendly license? Or are you using software that has vulnerabilities? Can we get sued? So these are things that people worry about when using open source software. So let's dive into one of the strong copyleft licenses that is the GPL 2.0. The most popular one is the Linux kernel, right? So here I put this here, and this website is called TLDR Legal. So it's basically if you're using some open source software, you don't understand the license, right? You can go to TLDR Legal and put the license name in there, and you will find some really useful color commentary here about what you cannot, and must do, right? So basically for GPL 2.0, you can distribute and modify the software as long as you track the changes in source files, right? So any modifications or any modified work that you make to GPL license code should also be available under the same license, right? So when you're making these changes and when you're incorporating something that is GPL into your proprietary code, you see what happens when they mix together. Then it means that your entire work should be released under the same license, right? So not everyone wants to release everything to open source, right? People want to also monetize on using open source and commercially selling their products, which is one of the use cases too, right? So you can do that, but you have to do it correctly. So here, as you can see with the CAN, you can use it for commercial use. You can modify it, you can distribute it, you can place warranty on it. You cannot sub-license it, right? You cannot license it under something else. You cannot hold the original authors liable for their work, right? And you also must include the original code in there, the code that you took and modified. You have to include it, and you should place it in a place that people can see it and download it, right? You also need to include the copyright. For example, I took Cassie's code. I will not take her copyright out of there. Her copyright is still there. I will stack my copyright there, right? And I will include the changes that I made to this file, and I will include the license as well, right? So these are the things you need to do to make sure you're complying with it. There's a lot more things. The license is pretty complicated, but this is some of the things you need to do when you're using GPL software. So this is an easy one. This is the MIT license, one of the most popular licenses you will see on GitHub as well, right? So let's see, and you can find the license text here on this link, but let's look at TLDR legal for this, right? So it says a short permissive license. You can do whatever you want as long as you include the original copyright and license notice in any copy of the software or the source, right? So basically this license, you can do whatever you want with it, except you cannot hold the original writer liable for using the software, right? You must include the copyright and you must include the license. So when they say when you must include the copyright, it means that, if I'm taking Cassie's work, I'm going to include her copyright, and you must include the license. So you must have license text there. That is the text of the MIT license in that file, right? So that's what that means. And these are my favorite ones. I see them all the time. So there's WTFPL, beerware. These licenses are called, the strange and vanity licenses. There's always laughter when you see code being used in companies under these licenses, right? And sometimes people really don't want to see them because let's look at what that license looks like, right? So this is the beerware license. It says you're allowed to do anything with the licensed material should the user of the product meet the author and consider the software useful. He is encouraged to buy the author a beer in return, right? So this is an actual license, and it's very weird, right? Um, no one's been sued because of this license, but you see a ton of these licenses out there, and it's mostly, a lot of it is just all fun and games, right? But the crux of this is that it's a permissive license and you can use it. Sometimes bigger companies might not want to see these licenses just because they're just weird and they cannot kind of fully comply with them, right? Anytime when there is like a question mark, okay, now if I don't buy this person a beer, what happens, right? I don't know. A lawyer might look at it and say, this is weird. I really don't want people to use this license, right? And you might have legal training to say that, developers in this company don't use this license, use MIT or use Apache or use one of those licenses, but not this license. But there's software out there that uses these licenses and they're very common, right? So yeah, so from what I've seen, I've been doing compliance for 10 years, and I did a lot of tech M&A, which means that looking at a lot of people's proprietary code and analyzing it for open source software and giving them results saying that, yeah, you're using GPL and are you shipping this? So, just make sure you're not using it incorrectly, flagging these issues and getting legal teams to look at things before there are problems, right? So the 95% of orgs are actually using open source in some form or another. I think Gartner did a survey of this, and this is the number that they kind of arrived at, is that this is how much is being used everywhere, right? So here, like we talked about with licensing, there is the usage and the distribution, and there's another notion of attribution. So what exactly is attribution, right? So when I use something that is copyrighted to someone else, depending on the license, as you saw with the TLDR legal, you are basically required to save the copyright data, and you're also required to reproduce the license. And this is called an attribution, right? So you are saying that I'm using this work in my work that was actually done by somebody else, and I'm giving credit to people who actually wrote the original program. So these are called third party notices, right? Let's see if I can. So there is this Google open source page that is very informative, and you will see a lot of what I'm talking about here, right? And let's see here. Okay. So this is one of the Oculus products, right? And you can see that there is a notice here. And this is what an attribution for open source usage looks like, right? So this is what companies do. So basically what they do is saying is that this product here is using simple JSON, right? Which is an open source component. And you find this component here in this GitHub website. And it is under the MIT license. And here's the copyright. It's written by, right? And then there is the entire text of the license here, right? Similarly, there's code site, same thing. You have the name, you have the URL, you have the copyright, and then you have the license text, right? So you can see that it's even for code snippets, right? It's not just if I'm copying a snippet of code, which is a couple lines of code, it doesn't mean that I should not be attributing from where I got that code, right? So you kind of have to give credit where credit is due. And here you can see that, this code was released as public domain, no restrictions, no requirements, no support, right? But you do have to comply with the license, and you do have to give attribution where you need to do it. So here you can see that for this product, this is the attribution notice. A lot of it is MIT, a lot of it is public domain, right? And these are, this license is a zlib license, which is what zlib is distributed under. And this is also a permissive license. So this is how it looks like when companies are using open source licenses and building their commercial products, right? So let's look here. So if you're working on an open source project, and I don't know if you guys have, we probably have already seen this, but I found this really useful in figuring out what to license your own work under, right? So you might want to see if, I want to work in a community. I want a bunch of developers using my code and also working on it. I want this to become a bigger than what I started it off as, right? Then you might want to figure out what license is best for that. I want it to be permissive. I'm going to use the MIT license, right? We saw the MIT license text. It's very permissive. You can do whatever you want with it. You just have to give attribution. Maybe that's what you want to do. You want to keep it simple. But now you also want to make sure that any modifications or any changes go back to the community, right? It means that if I modify your code, I need to state those changes, and I need to make sure I release the software under the same license. That's what we saw with the GPL license, right? So if you want to do that, then you can use the GPL license. And there's a bunch of stuff here that you can look at and see what choices you have. But 9 out of 10 times, people usually end up picking a BSD license or an MIT license or an Apache license. Those are the most common permissive licenses. If you want to go copy left, then of course there's the GPL license as well. And there is this concept of dual license, which you'll hear, which is something like a MySQL, where it's dual licensed under GPL or commercial. So if the terms of the GPL don't work for you, then you can pay licensing fees and use it however you want to use it. So dual licensing is also an option. If you wanna release your work under GPL, then you can have an option and say that, hey, you can pay me licensing and you don't have to use the GPL license. You just pay me the licensing fees and then you can use it however you want to do. So people do that a lot as well. But if you want to gain adoption and you really want a lot of people in the community working on it and using it, then the simpler the license is what I found is that's a way to go. So there is this, I'm not sure if you guys have seen it, maybe you have, but I work with some of the people who started this MLH Foundation, which has internships for open source, right? And it's, I think, a 12-week internship or something like that. But I think if you're interested and you want to apply, then I would just go here. It's a great program. I know a bunch of people who mentor students, and the person who started it happens to be my manager. So this is a really great program. So if you guys are interested in working open source, this is something that you can apply, and it seems like it's a really great program. And let's see here. That's maybe maybe we can open it up to Q&A, or I could talk about some other licensing stuff. But yeah, let me know what you guys think, and I'm here for questions.
Thank you, Indira, for telling us all about how to basically contribute responsibly, especially as some of us kind of start dabbling in open source. We did have a few questions in the chat. So the first one was from Nick, which I think his question is that why there is typically a license file in most software projects? And I believe that was whenever you were referring to the copyleft, copyright, and things like that.
Yeah, so let me, sorry, did I stop sharing? Okay, so you guys can see my screen, right? Okay, so this is an open source project that I'm one of the contributors for, and I worked on it for the last year or so. We just released it as open source. So this is a compliance project, right? So what it has is, it's so cute. I really love this guy. Here, so I'll show you a bunch of stuff that, that we had to take care of. So here, you're right. So this project is licensed under the Apache 2.0. That was the license we picked. And here you've got this license file, right, which has the license text of the Apache 2.0 license. And then you also, let's see here. Yeah. So basically what you need to do is always have the licensing file. And when you set up a project, you'll actually need to put a license file out there, and that choose a license will help you do that, right? There's also a contributors file, right? That you'll have like a bunch of, you can list your contributors there, right? And then you can have documentation on how to contribute, right? So you can have sign offs. So when you people are contributing to your project, you also need to make sure that those people are okay with contributing the code to the project, and that code is also going to be open sourced and available under the same license that your project is licensed under, right? So if someone is contributing code, you want it to actually be released under the license that your product is released under, right? So these are things that you have to consider. And when you set up a project, those are the first things you'll need to do, is to actually have copyright holders for your code files, license files, and stuff like that. That's a great question.
Thank you. The next question is actually from me. I was wondering, for some of the, I guess, copyright license types, why are they, I was wondering kind of why are they not able to hold the authors liable?
So it depends with software, the usage of it, right? It's say you use, for example, the struts thing, the Apache struts thing. What happened is struts had a dependency on this event stream node module, and that node module had a hole that hackers exploited and kind of got data from Equifax, right? So it was like, I don't know, millions of users, or I forget the exact number, but that much was impacted. So that's a lot of monetary impact, right? They lost a lot of money. So Struts was never held liable for that, right? It was something that Equifax should have patched. So the onus is on the user, and it's the same with you could use Linux kernel anywhere, right? And you could use it, and then things could fail. That doesn't mean you hold the writers or the authors of the software responsible. So that's how the licensing is set up, is that you use it, but you're using it at your own risk. So the risk is yours.
Awesome. That's good to know. Thank you.
Sure.
And then I believe this is, well, this is from the Developers Guild. I'm not sure which person is on that, but they're asking who enforces the licenses and copyrights?
So usually in companies there are legal teams, right, who enforce licensing and copyright. So for example, you go join a Google or a Facebook or an Apple or whatever, you join a startup, right? You will need to kind of take training or some form of a boot camp or something like that, that will actually kind of train you in how to use any work that is not your own, right? So there's going to be that training. It's usually legal teams who enforce it while you're writing code for the company you work at. Now, if you're just doing this for a hobby, and you're like, a lot of people write code, right? So it's you who has to make sure that you are respecting people's original work, and make sure that you're retaining the copyright. You read the license, you make sure what the license is, and kind of decide that, yeah, I'm gonna make sure that I put a notice together, I put the license in there, and I don't kind of violate the licensing terms. So it's, you have to take that responsibility, but usually in companies it's legal teams.
Thank you. And then my last question is, how, if you were the contributor, if you're the author, how would you know, for example, if someone else used your code improperly?
Yeah, these are all the lawsuits in the open source community, right? Somebody downloads the binary, reverse engineers it, and kind of figures out that, hey, you're using my code. So usually this is how people kind of figure out that you're using something, and you're not either paying that person, or you're not putting an attribution note. We saw the Oculus notice, right? That's similar in a lot of places where you have a product, you will see third-party notices out there for public consumption. Now people can say, oh, you're using jQuery, but you didn't kind of attribute jQuery, right? It's not a lawsuit worthy kind of thing, but it's also a PR thing where someone might say, oh, you're using something, but you're not giving credit to the author. So there's two things. One is improper use of the license, right? With the Google versus Oracle, that kind of lawsuit. And Cisco Linksys, that's a big one, right? Where you use something and you're not using it correctly. So people find out by reverse engineering or whatever way they found out, and then they sue you. And the other thing is you right click and you view source and you see you see a whole bunch of stuff there, and then you're like, hey, you didn't credit me, but it seems like this is my stuff, right? So there's a lot of ways that you can actually find out. And there's tooling there to help do this, which is some of the tooling that I work on. There's commercial software that you can use as scanners. There's also open source scanners that will scan your code and tell you if you're using stuff that's not your copyright. So there's scan code that you can kind of put your code through scanning. So it's a lot of it is open sourced already, and that's the stuff I work on. So it'll tell you if you're using stuff and you're not attributing.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, I think if there are no more questions, then I think we can go ahead and wrap it up. Oh, it looks like Nick has one more question.
Yeah, are we allowed to unmute and talk?
Sure.
Okay. I don't know if I heard you answer the question, but I was wondering like what kind of tools you use to assist in discovering licenses that are being used and making sure those licenses are still in compliance. Like I would assume throughout like your daily job.
Yeah, so there's a lot of tools that people use, right? And there's commercial tools. There's I don't know if you heard about this Black Duck. That is one of the most widely used scanners as White Source.
Yeah, I actually work at Synopsys.
Oh,
So
you do great.
so yeah, okay, awesome. I was
Yeah.
I was out of curiosity. I know it's really popular, but I was wondering if there's anything else you go to that that you like personally enjoy. I know there's a lot of different things that people use for a lot of different reasons.
Cool. Yeah, good to meet you, Nick. Yeah, so I think I'm a big fan of scan code. I really like scan code. So it's let me share the link with you. Okay, so here, so I really like these guys, and it's a pretty good scanner. You also need to so you work at Synopsys, so you know how this goes, right? So you also need to look at source, you also need to look at binaries, you also need to look at dependencies, you need to look at everything, right? So there's a lot of scanners that do some things well and they don't do the other things well. I would say with scan code, they do have a range of tools to do a bunch of stuff, but there's also this something called snippet matching that is um, that's very important to companies. Is that where people cut and paste code from, like, say, a Stack Overflow or a blog or wherever, right? And they put it in their code and then it's released, and then, hey, guess what, this was a bad license, we shouldn't be using it. How do you find that, right? Like, how do you actually go in and find those snippet matches? So Black Tech is one of the scanners who does that. There's several other commercial vendors who do that. There's Scan OSS, which is pretty good. So there's a lot of tooling in there that will help you take a look at all these different kinds of indicators of third party and kind of tell you that here's what you're using. And then people go in there and figure out what you should be using and what you shouldn't be using. So there's a lot of scanners out there. They all do different things. Some of them are great at something, some of them are not so great. I also help companies figure out what works best for their use case, right? You might be a company with a SaaS product, you might be a company that is selling a device. Somebody who's selling a device, they really need to care a lot about what's going in their products, right? Because the licensing becomes different based on the usage and the type of product. So they might want to actually look at snippets and do that kind of stuff. So it depends on what you're using. For most cases, I really like Scan Code. It's a pretty good scanner. And it's free. It's open sourced. It's awesome.
Nice. Awesome. Thank you very much for your answer.
Sure.
So thank you again, Indira, helping us learn how to, contribute responsibly, and as well as providing us with the MLH Fellowship resource, and the other resources like the GitHub scan code. I think that'll be really interesting to use as we start contributing and making sure that we're, staying compliant and everything. So yeah, I think that will conclude our thing. I'll stop recording.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
See ya.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.